So as you know, we're going to be looking at this bit of material in video format. And we are picking up here where the previous material left off. I suggest that you watch this set of slides, listen to this set of slides on the system's perspective before you read about the system's perspective in the articles and the chapter photocopies that I gave you in class. And then you might even actually want to read those over and then look at this again, and it might make a little bit more sense the second time around. So the systems perspective is something that came after that classical management, scientific management, and the perspective that came from the guy named Frederick Taylor and his time and motion studies and so forth. And it was really, systems theory became a reaction against, like many of the things we're going to look at, reaction against the previous perspective, that scientific one way is the right way thinking. Peter Senge, and no one really knows how to pronounce that name, says that the unhealthiness of our world today is in direct proportion to our inability to see it as a whole. And what he means by that is that he has a systems point of view. In other words, when you view things as a system, everything is interconnected and everything affects everything else. Everything is interdependent. And that's a very big change from the scientific management perspective, which says that you can isolate variables, you can control things, and everything is, there's one right way to do everything, each thing, and that they may not even be interconnected at all, and that's a very limited short-term perspective and isolated perspective. The systems approach sees everything as part of a whole and that it's interconnected. So let's just review, let's look at the main goals here of systems theory. So the goals of this perspective in terms of organizations is to describe organizations, explain organizations, and seek ways to, as they say, balance the system. So if we were looking at the scientific management material, they're not trying to describe, explain, and seek a balance. They're trying to predict, control, and figure out the one best way to do things. In contrast, systems is much more of a descriptive, explanatory model where they're not trying to find the one best way. They're trying to describe things and explain the way they are. So here's some of the main concepts in systems theory. The next few slides unpack the various concepts. First of all, interdependence. I already indicated this a few minutes ago, and that is that organizations and individuals do not exist as isolated entities. Everything is connected in some way or another to everything else. So if I call in sick, for example, that clearly affects everybody else in the organization, especially the people that work right around me. But it also affects other people in ways that they might not even realize. Let's say I call in sick, or a couple people call in sick. The other people that don't work with me directly, maybe they find a parking spot a little more easily. They might not be able to get their needs met because they contact someone in my department, and because I'm not there, they're short-staffed, and so things might slow down a little bit. So everything is interconnected in one way or another. Feedback is another big one. Feedback can be to encourage, in other words, positive feedback, or correct negative feedback. And we mean that in a technical term. Positive, you can actually encourage more bad behavior. Maybe you know with kids, if you don't handle raising kids right, you can actually encourage bad behavior by paying attention to it and giving them lots of feedback and attention that then will make them say, oh, that's how I get attention. So that can be encouraging even though it's not what you want. And corrective feedback is feedback that tries to change what's going on, tries to prevent things from going in that direction in the future. Openness is real simple. Systems are open. Organizations are open to their environment, and we don't just mean the weather, for example, that kind of environment, but their environment that you work in. You know, the economy and the other kinds of competition that might be out there for your organization. How many people are you able to hire? Is it a tight labor market? Is it a competitive place to get hired? And what's the expertise out there, and you draw from that pool of expertise to hire the right people. So the general environment that you're in. The environment's also very unpredictable. That's another concept under openness. Because things are open to their environment, organizations are open, it's also very unpredictable. You can't exactly tell the right thing to do at all times. And this is really the kind of concept that drives people in the scientific management, classical management, bureaucracy world crazy. They don't like unpredictability. They want things to be very predictable, and they want to control the outcomes as much as possible. But from a system standpoint, they're saying, hey, the world, let's start with you just accepting the fact that the world is an unpredictable place for organizations, and then we can go from there. And then organizations are also networks or webs of relationships. The current generation, especially in undergrad and even grad school, we understand now with social media and so forth that everything is interconnected, and it's all really a system of relationships. It's like a network. Most organizations, however, are still functioning over the top-down chain of command, that military model hierarchy, and that's really not mostly the way organizations communicate. If you look at the way they actually communicate, they do it through their network connections, their people that they know. And so all these concepts really fly directly in the face of the classical management, scientific management approach. So the metaphor for a system, an organizational system especially, is that it's a biological organism. That's the metaphor. And you don't have to memorize the parts of the cell. I just put it up there because the cell shows the complexity and the interdependence of very small living things. And also the idea that each system has three more concepts: inputs, processes, and outputs. So an input, of course, is anything that goes into the system. If you were an organization, you would say, oh, those people you hire, those are your resources. Like, let's say you're a lumber company. Well, you need to bring in trees to then process and make them into usable boards. Those are inputs. Any intelligence or knowledge or expertise that comes in the door to do the work, anything at all, really, that you need, the computers that you buy and bring in, those are all considered inputs. And then the processes, well, that's the actual work that you do. That's the work that you do. You're picking up, you're writing things down, you're sending emails, you are shredding documents, you're going to meetings, you're filling your coffee. All these things are little activities, are called processes. And if you think about it, if you stopped doing those processes, you just stopped doing all those little things, then the organization would just freeze up, that nothing would happen. If you didn't answer your phones or emails or talk to anybody, everything would just grind to a halt. And so those processes are work. That's the work you do, the activities. The outputs, those are the things that come out of the organization. Maybe that's the finished product for your lumber company or for your computer production company, or maybe your consulting company. Maybe the consulting company delivers workshops or helps you analyze data and they give you a report. That's the final product. And every organization has its outputs: pizza, hamburgers, products going off the shelves. Systems also have other outputs, however, that you might not normally think of. Like maybe, have you ever thought about trash? You take the trash out, right? If you work at a restaurant, that's an output. And other things are outputs as well. Perhaps the emotional and mental and physical exhaustion that the workers bring home sometimes during really, really difficult work periods. And that's an output, because then that goes outside of the system and affects other people. And a cell is very much like that. That's why we have this cell here, because it has inputs. It needs food. It needs different supplies from its environment come in, and then the little workers within the cell move those different nutrients to different parts and process them, and then they have outputs. The waste comes out of that semi-permeable membrane, and it produces outputs. So everything is really, you can see almost everything as a system. A car is a system, has inputs, processes, outputs. The inputs are gasoline, oxygen for the engine to actually run, the oil, and all the other things you put into it. And then the processes, your engine is moving, the pistons are firing back and forth, boom, 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 boom. And the driver is steering the driving wheel, pressing the gas pedal, and so forth. And then the output. Their outputs are obviously things like exhaust and maybe leaving tread marks on the roads and dripping oil onto the driveway. But it's also getting you where you're going. Transportation is one of the, getting from A to B. That's a goal that's achieved, and that's an output, getting someone all the way across town. That's part of what's delivered. So everything can really be seen as a system of inputs, processes, and outputs. So within systems, it's really a balancing act. And the first part of that balancing act is something called entropy. Entropy is a big fancy word, and it means the tendency of systems to move toward disorganization or deterioration. So pulling back some of the earlier examples, if you don't maintain your car, for example, it's going to break down. It tends toward disorganization and deterioration. You literally have to bring it into to get service, to change the oil, to put gas in it, to get little things fixed before they turn into big things. Same thing with your apartment. I mean, if you think about your housing situation, how long could you go without cleaning things before, let's say you just stopped doing any kind of laundry, any kind of dishes, any kind of picking up at all. How long before that apartment looked like someone had ransacked it, someone came in and stole everything? It would look pretty bad pretty quickly because you have maintenance. Maintenance goes into this and prevents it from deteriorating. Same thing with our physical bodies. You need showers, you need to clip your fingernails and brush your teeth and wash and change your clothes because your body is a system and it's heading toward disorganization if you don't do something about it to maintain. So the concept of homeostasis helps explain this. Systems and people in systems tend to want to balance or maintain the status quo in a system. So that word maintain, and the status quo just means the current state of things. So a lot of the work we do in organizations, if you think about the activities we do at work, it's maintaining, right? You have to update files, you have to take the trash out, charge your computer battery, you have to return calls. A lot of this is just keeping up. It's not necessarily moving your projects ahead, it's just maintaining to keep things in a balance. And when things are in a balance, it's called homeostasis, and the effort to get things back to that status quo, that's called maintenance. I once, as a conversation with a good friend of mine about maintenance, he said, and we were reflecting on all the things that you have to do to maintain, like mowing the lawn and showering, and he said, I think 80% of life is maintenance. And we both kind of sad about that. You think, wow, 80% of life is maintenance. And I said, well, what's the other 20%? And he paused for a second and said, drama. He has 3 daughters, and I guess that's his world is mostly maintenance, but a little bit of drama mixed in. So systems do have goals. However, they're not the kinds of goals that are like classical management, scientific management goals. Goals from a systems standpoint are negotiated, they are interdependent, and they're contingent. So in other words, goals are not one fixed goal. The goals will change over time, and the different parts of the system, they're interdependent. They all work together, and so their goals might not be all exactly the same, but they might point in the same general direction, but they also might change over time. You negotiate things as you move forward. Deadlines might change a little bit. Projects take a little longer, a little shorter than you think they're going to, more or less resources than you think they're going to, and so the goals are developing or emerging over time. Even though you might start with a stated goal, it might change by the time you get there. Equifinality is a really big systems concept, and that's the idea that the same goal can be reached in multiple ways. So there's no one right. This, again, classical management, there's one right way. Well, this is another systems idea that drives classical management, scientific management people nuts. They say, no, it's not one right way. In fact, there are multiple ways we can reach the same goal. However, a lot of people misunderstand that and think that any way is equal. In other words, hey, who's to say which way is the right way? You want to drive to Buffalo, I want to drive to Buffalo. My way is probably just as good as yours. Well, here's the 2 parts of equifinality. First of all, there's no best way. Second, all ways of organizing are not equally effective. And that's a very important systems concept. In other words, no, they're not all the same. Some are better than others. We don't know ahead of time which one is the very best, if in fact there is a best, and there probably isn't. But if I want to drive to Buffalo, some ways are definitely better than others. If I'm in Rochester and I want to get to Buffalo, and I say, well, first of all, to go to Buffalo, I want to swing by Syracuse first. All right, well, that's the opposite direction. So that's definitely not going to be as effective as going directly on Route 90, for example, I-90 to Buffalo. That will be better than your plan to go to Syracuse. It might not be the very best way, and depending on traffic flow, time of day, whether or not there are accidents or roads out of service and so forth, there might be some ways that are a little better than others, but it's tough to say. If you've ever tried to time your commute to work and you think you have the one best way, then, maybe it's not always the best, again, depending upon those environmental factors. And so goals are important in the system's perspective. However, the idea of equifinality really complicates things if people are going to stick to this kind of classical management / scientific management, Frederick Taylor perspective that there's only one right way. There may be lots of different ways. They're not all the same, and some are better than others, and some of them are terrible ideas, but there's no one right way. And so we're letting go here from a system standpoint that there's only one way to do things. And so that wraps up these slides on systems theory. This is the next step after classical management. And from here, we're going to go into Carl Weick's ideas about sense-making and some of the related ideas he has about organizations. And he doesn't name this idea of systems theory, and he doesn't quote these concepts directly or very often, but he comes out of a perspective where he believes systems theory, he takes it into account, and that really is the unspoken lens or unspoken perspective behind a lot of the ideas. So he starts with system theory and then he builds upon it. So we'll turn to Weick in the next set of slides.